computer. Yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the very first show of our podcast. I am joined by a very, very special guest today, Edwin Dorsey of the famed Bear Cave newsletter, which focuses on flagging companies with deceptive and fraudulent practices. Edwin is only 24 years old, but he has been featured. He has been featured on CNBC. He has been profiled in the Institutional Investor and on the Wall Street Journal. You might think that what can we learn from a short seller about compounding wealth, given that an unleveraged short position can just give you a 2x in theory. But Edwin is really a true pioneer. He has built an incredible business around the Bear Cave, and there are so many lessons that we can learn from him, both from an investing standpoint, but also from a business standpoint and a standpoint of what Edwin can teach us next in our careers. So Edwin, thank you so much for joining, and it is a true pleasure and true honor to have you as the first guest. Thanks for joining.
Raj, I am thrilled and honored to be here. We're going to have a great discussion, and this is going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, this is going to be a lot of fun. And as you know, there are a lot of questions. So I kind of want to dive into this right away. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, and what sparked your early interest in investing?
Yeah, so I grew up in upstate New York, Rochester, New York, the oldest of four boys. There's a saying I like: you don't choose your passions choose you. And my passion from a really young age, like second grade, was the stock market. I was just all in on stocks. I like business. I like the concept of, like, clear performance and outperformance. I love researching companies. I was really curious. For whatever reason, the stock market just was my thing from an incredibly young age. Some things that helped me early on with the passion was my grandmother started buying me books on investing, and I'd read all of them. I'd watch a lot of YouTube videos with Warren Buffett. And then the thing that took it to another level is my grandmother put, I think, like $10,000 in an E-Trade account, and she didn't give me the money, but she gave me the username and password and let me invest her money on her behalf. And that was a lot of fun, especially being like 12 or whatever and getting to trade real money. That was crazy. So that's what kind of made it my thing. And then in high school, I started writing a little bit on Seeking Alpha, anonymously. In college, I made the transition to the short side, but that was kind of the basics of the early days for me.
Right. When you were in high school, were you investing a little bit of real money on the side as well while writing those Seeking Alpha articles?
So I had, a little bit of my own money. I had my grandmother's money. My uncle was impressed with me, so he let me start managing his retirement account. And I start networking with all the hedge fund managers and asset managers in Rochester, New York. And there aren't that many, but I start going to meet with them as just a high schooler, and I got a lot of early mentors that way. And then the kind of big lucky break for me, what happened to spark the Bear Cave is freshman year of college, I got introduced to two of the best short sellers out there. One is Mark Gahodes and the other is Jim Carruthers. Mark, I met through a young guy, Chris Gross, who introduced us. And, I gave him a call. I introduced myself and he immediately hung up. And I was like, oh, shoot, that's not good. But then I called him again and bugged him and asked him so many questions. He eventually had sympathy for me and let me go up to his chicken farm in Northern California. I remember it was like an hour and a half Uber, and it was very expensive. And I go to meet with him, and he's in these pink Crocs, and he's like a little crazy, and he's telling me all these war stories of taking down fraudsters and short selling. And right then and there, he forces me to make a Twitter account, and he starts tweeting about me, and he gets me my first few hundred followers. And that was a big lucky break. And then the other thing that happened is Jim Carruthers at this short-only hedge fund called Sophos, him and his analysts were apparently reading my anonymous blog, and they didn't know it was me, but my blog said I was a student at Stanford, a person at Stanford. I didn't even clarify I was a student. and they invited me to like get lunch with them. And I think they were shocked to see that it was a 17-year-old they were reading, and they thought I was a professor or something. And they were a little impressed. And then I started interning at Sophos on and off for all 4 years of college, and they taught me a ton. They taught me the ropes, how to dig into companies, how to read SEC filings, how to do all this real research. And the impetus for starting the Bear Cave from there was I needed a job my senior year, and I naturally would have gone to Sophos, but they were in the process of shutting down, so I couldn't work for them. I was talking to a bunch of New York City hedge funds, but they're all like suit and tie and fancy and focus on modeling, and I just knew culturally I wouldn't be a good fit at a lot of them. So I started this newsletter as a way to get attention and hopefully get hired by someone great. Then the pandemic came, and I did this newsletter during the pandemic. It got pretty big, and long story short, I started charging for it, and it grew, and it became a full-time income. And it's the only thing I've done since graduating, and I couldn't be happier with it.
It's a really fascinating story, and I want to dive deeper into that. But I also want to dive deeper into your time during Stanford. One of the questions I had is that what made you want to major in economics instead of finance? And I really wanted to ask you about your academic experience at Stanford, because there's a lot of criticism about the way finance and investing is taught in business school. And I wonder if you took something away from your academic coursework as it pertains to investing, because there must be a lot, there will be a lot of young listeners listening to this podcast thinking, what should I do, what should I major in college if I'm interested in investing? And I'm curious to know what your answer is to that, given that you went to such an amazing school.
Raj, I would say it kind of doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So I was an economics major because there was no finance major. You could take
Okay.
finance courses, but there was no
Right.
specific finance major. And frankly, I didn't love economics. I don't
Uh-huh.
think I've used a single thing I've learned from any of those classes. I've learned that there's like often you kind of just need to make your own luck or take matters into your own hand. And Stanford is a very computer science heavy school. It's a great
Right.
place to go if you want to code. It's not a
Mm-hmm.
great place to go if you're like very passionate about the stock market, and the stock market clubs are kind of basic, not great. But one thing
Mm-hmm.
I did do, where I got my money's worth wasn't the undergrad classes, but I would just email professors at the business school saying, hey, like, can I sit in your class? We don't need
Uh-huh.
to do any forms. I don't need any credit. Just like, can I sit in? And a lot of them would just say, yeah. So I would
Mm-hmm.
go to these business school classes, which were 200 times better than the undergrad ones, and I have great guest speakers. Oftentimes the professors wouldn't reply. So I would just go to the business school and knock on their door. And then you can't say no to somebody's face. You know, what
Uh-huh.
are you going to say to a student? No, you can't learn. So that's where I would say I did my real learning, was
Mm-hmm.
either sitting in on business school classes and meeting people that way. I had a few great professors. One professor I met with probably close to 100 times
Mm-hmm.
at Stanford. We more or less had a standing weekly meeting where I would just go and
Uh-huh.
ask him a bunch of questions. And that became great. Another real advantage of, when you're young is people want to meet with you, people want to help you, and that fades really quick as soon as you graduate. And once you're an adult, once you're out of college, you're kind of expected to fend for yourself. But as long as you're a college student, you got a cuteness factor. People want to help you. And one thing I did well is I took full advantage of the at stanford.edu email. I probably sent more than 1,000 cold emails to people asking them to meet with me. And the thing with cold emailing is the response rate is
Yeah.
always going to be low, but
A numbers game. Yeah.
that was another thing that helps. So the emphasis here is basically all my classes were useless, but you found ways to get value out of other things.
Yeah, I am a true gopher at heart. I'm an international student, so coming to the United States really changed my life. I wouldn't change my college experience for anything in the world, but I have to agree with you that when it comes to learning finance and investing, or business school academics in general, is largely a waste of time. And I would just really advise listeners to just, pick up like whatever the Benjamin Graham Dodd book, or sorry, David Dodd book, and just start from there, or start with the Berkshire Hathaway annual reports. And that's a really great way to learn investing. There are so many people, even for example, if you take someone like Charlie Munger, he's never had any business school training. he majored, I think, in like something like related to like climate science, and then he went to law school. And a lot of people have such idiosyncratic backgrounds going into investing. And I totally agree with that, that there's probably not much of a benefit of going to a business school specifically to just learn about investing. Another thing I wanted to ask you about your time at Stanford is, did you feel very different compared to your classmates? Because coming into undergrad, you knew what you wanted to do, which I believe wasn't the case, which I believe generally isn't the case with a very large majority of the students going to any college. And because that you got into short selling starting your freshman year, did you feel more like an outsider, since like that's an anti-establishment thing to do when you were yourself were at like a very establishment place?
Yeah, Viraj, I was definitely a little bit of a black sheep in college,
Yeah.
especially at Stanford, where again, no one goes to Stanford who's passionate about stocks. You go there where you like computer science. And I think over 90% of students at Stanford take a coding course. And
Mhm.
I'm scared of computers, frankly. I'm like the least, I like to joke I was the least tech savvy guy at Stanford.
Uh-huh.
So I was definitely a little bit of a black sheep there and different. I was different also in knowing pretty certainly what I wanted to do. From a young age, I always said I wanted to launch a hedge fund. I wanted to do stocks. And I think most people, at a young age have no idea what they want to do.
Mhm.
And over time they narrow in. I've kind of been the opposite, where second grade I wanted to do a hedge fund, third grade I wanted to do a freshman year of college
Yeah.
I wanted to do a hedge fund. But over time I've definitely, actually widened my horizons, where, I'm now doing a newsletter. If you wanted to make a lot of money, launching a hedge fund is the number one option. And I think I definitely would have the opportunity to launch one in a few years if I wanted to. I'm
Mhm.
not sure necessarily if that's what I want to do. But yeah, I was definitely a little different. I got into a lot of fights with the Stanford
Yep,
administration,
we're gonna
partly
get into
over,
that. Yeah.
but yeah, I was definitely a little odd.
Uh-huh. And although you knew that you were interested in investing, did you ever even give a second's worth of thought to investment banking? Since that is what you're supposed to do, you have to get those 2 years in order to move on to the buy side. And second part of that question is, do you think investment banking training is necessary to be an analyst at a hedge fund? Again, this is a question for the young listeners in college who I'm sure are actively thinking about this, where they're like, maybe investment banking, nah, but it's something that I probably will end up I have to be doing.
Yeah, I wanted to avoid investment
Yeah.
banking at all costs. I am not an investment banker. I'm very
Yeah.
much a nonconformist. I
Uh-huh.
work my own hours. I march to the
Yeah.
beat of my own drummer.
Uh-huh.
I would be a terrible investment banker. Or if I would be okay, I would be dying inside. So
Right.
I knew I didn't want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
My entire life was finding like the more off the beaten pathways to
Sure.
do things like cold emailing, like knocking on doors and that sort of thing. So I knew I wouldn't be doing investment banking. Now, whether or not it's like good a skill set to have to be an analyst,
Mm-hmm.
my general view is good advice needs to be personalized advice. Blank a la carte advice is not good. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really the right person to give an informed opinion. And even if I was the right person, my opinion wouldn't be the one that is right for all listeners. But I think if you need to learn the basics, if you're going in without a ton of knowledge, yeah, investment banking is a great way to earn a lot of money, save a lot of money, get a good skill set, and do it for 2 years and progress to the next thing. That's perfectly fine. What I'd also like to pound into people is there's always a way to do things a little differently. If you think
Right.
you're really talented, if you think investing, if you've been doing it for a few years and you think you're a little smart, why not cold email a
Yeah.
bunch of people? Why not literally mail your resumes to a bunch of hedge fund? Like, you need to be a little different. Why not, if you're a college student, just walk in the door to a hedge fund and just say, meet with me. I mean, if you're a little crazy and you're willing to put yourself out there, I definitely think there's ways to avoid it. Um,
Yeah.
that's my high level view.
Yeah. And I completely agree with that point of like, especially when you're a college kid as a freshman and sophomore, most people really want to help you. And if they say no, it's probably because they're ultra busy. The way I actually ended up in the United States is that just before the end of my junior year in high school, I'd reached out to a University of Minnesota alum who runs his own fund, and he was profiled on Forbes. And I reached out to him, stayed in touch with him throughout my senior year in high school. And he was the one that told me to apply to the University of Minnesota. And I ultimately had an offer from here. And my two final choices were Minnesota and a school in Canada where it was under the Department of Mathematics. The name of the degree was financial modeling. And I asked him, should I do this? And his response was, to me, financial modeling is largely a waste of time. And when I told my dad that, he was pretty disappointed to hear that. But I was like, since he said, let me just go to Minnesota and give this a shot. And I've never looked back since. And truly, if you are creative in terms of cold emailing as many people as you can, mailing out your resume, people don't mind being pissed off when you're a freshman and sophomore in college. They really want to see that you have that kind of self-initiative. So that's great advice. Thanks for sharing that.
I know. I want to piggyback on that. A little
Yeah.
bit of initiative goes a very, very
Yeah.
long way. Just even just a little bit goes a long way.
Yeah.
And you will not piss people off if you cold email them once, or if you ask them once to like meet with you or
Yeah.
something.
Hmm.
It should feel very natural and normal. And yeah.
Yeah. You also met Jim Chanos and Bill Ackman during your time in college. I'd be grateful to share what those experiences were like. And I believe Jim Chanos also offered you an internship, but you turned that down. I wish I was in that fortunate a scenario as you.
You've really, really done your homework, Raj. You've listened to everything about me.
Yeah.
So yeah, I met Jim Chanos. I was a college student. He was a guest lecturer at Stanford, and somebody
Uh-huh.
had told both of us we should meet one another.
Right.
So what he doesn't know and what no one knows is I had actually pissed off the business school professor who let me sit in the class where Chanos was speaking, because
Yeah.
I kept asking questions, and I didn't know you were not allowed to do that if you're an undergrad. Because her view was, I was doing you a favor to be in this class. Why
Yeah.
are you like trying to like ask questions? So she told me that day when Chanos was coming, Edwin, you can't say a word. Like, don't say anything. I'm pissed at
Mm.
you. Like, you gotta stop. You gotta cut it out. And I was like a little nervous because I was getting criticized. And Chanos comes in and he's asking all these business school students questions, and they weren't actually doing a good job answering them. And he calls on me, like out of the blue, like, Edwin, start talking about Mallinckrodt was the company. And I
Uh-huh.
look at the professor, and she had no idea I knew Chanos, so we knew each other. And I start talking, and she comes up to me and apologizes after. And I thought it was the funniest thing in the world. The last thing on her mind would be that Chanos comes into her classroom and knows like the random college student who she'd been letting like sit in class. And yeah, and then I think we got lunch after at the dining pavilion at the business school. An incredibly nice guy.
Yep.
Chanos is known to spend a lot of time mentoring young people and being very
Mhm.
generous with his time and money. And he's lived like a very fascinating life. I think
Mhm.
he's a wonderful human being. Um, yeah, and it's not that he offered me an internship and turned it down. He kind of like toyed with it, and it might have
Right.
not worked out because I already had some
Yeah.
commitment that summer. Interning for Chanos would definitely be like quite the catch and a great
Uh-huh.
experience. So I was really, really impressed by Chanos, and I'm a huge fan of him. And he's obviously a reader of the Bear Cave, and I love his tweets. Bill Ackman was junior year of college. I was doing a program called Stanford in New York, where you study, it's like study abroad, but study in New York City. And
Mhm.
I go, and like I told you, I cold emailed a bunch of people. And of course, I cold
Mhm.
emailed all the hedge fund managers. And for Ackman, I kind of know a little bit about him. So my subject line was fan mail, and I knew he would open it. And then I sent him like a 2-paragraph thing on why I'm such a fan of his, because I knew if there's anybody who would appreciate that, there would be Ackman. And to my amazement, he responded. He's like, my secretary will set something up. And I went and I met with him for an hour or
Uh-huh.
45 minutes. And, very, very sharp guy. I prepared like a little stock pitch presentation presentation, and I kept remembering he kept forcing me to go faster through it. He's like,
Right.
next page, next page. But then we talked for a while after, and I was asking him a bunch of questions, and he seemed like a very normal, smart, thoughtful guy. And that's what I've learned is a lot of really successful people, even if they like play stuff up on TV or seem a little
Yeah.
crazy, to be successful, you need to be generally pretty good at managing people and schmoozing and making someone feel good about themselves. So,
Mhm.
but both of them I left with a decently high opinion of and thought they were very smart.
Sure. Thanks for sharing that, Edwin. Can you share the story of how you got into short selling and what makes you passionate about exposing fraud and misconduct?
Yeah, so it was really, partly when I was managing my uncle's money in high school, I invested a lot of his money in Valiant, and then Valiant collapsed. And I'm like, oh shoot. Like, I literally remember reading the Citron report
Yeah.
from like the bleachers of my high school, being like, who is this Citron guy who's making my uncle's Valiant stock go down? I'm gonna buy more
Uh-huh.
from him. And clearly I was wrong. And then I started digging in, and that's kind of how I found Mallinckrodt, because it was a Valiant lookalike. And then from there, it was really just Mark and Jim Carruthers, where Jim was the best boss I think I ever had. I was really lucky to have such a great boss. And if a hedge fund gives you a great internship freshman year on something that seems really cool, you're going to naturally gravitate there. So,
Hmm.
I don't think I've ever shorted a stock personally. In college, I think I bought,
Hmm.
might have traded options just a little, but even now, I really don't buy puts or short anything. That may change in the future, but I don't. It's more that I love digging into companies and it's
Right.
finding misconduct. I'm not like most people where I'm not focused on valuations or real businesses that have a few flaws. I like finding the most egregious cases in the market and writing about them.
Uh-huh. Thanks for sharing that. Why are we in the golden age of fraud, as Jim Chanos puts it, or in the legal age of fraud, as Bethany McLean puts it? What have been the catalysts for this to happen post the global financial crisis? And in which industries do you see a lot of like the froth and grifting in? Like EVs comes to mind, biotech comes to mind. Why is this happening?
So that's a multi-part question. The first part here is the golden age of fraud. I think anytime you've got a lot of easy flowing money, that makes
Yep.
good people do bad things and bad people do worse things. So what comes to mind is a lot of VC funds just being allocated willy-nilly without a
Hmm.
lot of diligence. You've got these like SPAC nonsense going on. You've just
Yeah.
got huge amounts of money flowing around, partly maybe a zero interest rate
Yeah.
phenomenon. That produces not great results from like an ethics and fraud perspective. Another problem, at least in the public markets, is you had 2 years ago at least a huge amount of retail participation, especially at the start of the pandemic. And that's not good because retail investors are just a lot less sophisticated than professional ones, and they'll fall for nonsense professional investors might not fall for. Like the example I like to give is this company, Ag Eagle Aerial Systems, that was making drones. And they said, we're going to make next generation delivery drones. They hinted that they had a partnership with Amazon, whatever. But I dug around them in 1 hour. It turned out their drone was literally just a remote control helicopter with a GoPro. There was no chance of an Amazon partnership, and their R&D over the last 4 years had been like $50,000. So they just had nothing, and they had a bunch of ties to stock promoters. But somehow they got to $1 billion market cap. Wall Street bets loved them. There was like not a high short interest, and it just like this is stuff I can find in my sleep. It's like so egregious, and just individual investors are suckered in. So a higher level of individual participation, I think, is another negative. And then the last thing is, if regulators don't hold individuals accountable and they just hold companies accountable, I think that leads to a lot of bad outcomes because you might be looking at the numbers and say, hey, I can get pretty rich, and if I get
Mhm.
caught, the company just pays a fine. Like, not for a lot of people, that might not be a bad trade-off.
Right. Uh, no interview or with you, Edwin, or your experience at Stanford is not complete without your story of care.com. So I'd love to if you could share that story in long version.
Yes. Well, I'm
Yeah.
thrilled you asked I
Yeah.
love telling this story.
Yeah.
So how did I get like, what played a role in my rise to prominence and really affected me more than anything else? It's this care.com story. And I'll tell you the whole story. Freshman year of college, I'm chilling, it's summer, whatever, having fun. And a girl I knew said, hey, you should look at this company, care.com. Something doesn't seem right about them. I signed up to be a babysitter on the platform, and now I'm getting death threats from scammers. And I'm like, that sounds a little crazy. Let me look into it. And I'd done some basic stock research. So I start reading the SEC filings. I see there's a bunch of litigation. I look on Pacer to read all the lawsuits. And, there had been a bunch of lawsuits from families whose kids were harmed by babysitters hired through care.com, alleging they didn't do their background checks properly. And then I was like reading a lot of local news stories of babysitters who were just like care.com babysitters who are crazy and hurting their kids, and like some had criminal histories. And I'm like, this seems really bad. Let me dig into it a little more. So I start digging into it, and basically care.com, the largest babysitting platform in the US, publicly traded, roughly $1 billion market cap. Their big thing is safety. Were they actually running the background checks they claim to be on babysitters? So I decide now, like my sophomore year in college, I'm going to test out their background check system by trying to apply to be a babysitter on care.com as Harvey Weinstein. So I use a photo of Harvey Weinstein. I use an email address, harveythebabysitter@gmail.com. I make up a social security number. I, consent to their background checks, make up an address. It's just a clearly fake account as Harvey Weinstein. And, I submit it, and they say, we're going to run the background check. We'll get back to you in 2 or 3 days on whether or not you're approved. And to my amazement, 3 days later, I get an email from care.com. Hello, Harvey, you passed our background check. You're CPR certified now, blah, you're like our second highest tier of authenticity. You are a care.com babysitter. And I could start applying to babysitting jobs as Harvey Weinstein. And I'm like, oh my goodness, they're lying about doing their background checks. And of course, I screenshotted all this, like documented the whole process. And, I decide to write a little story and tweet it out, and it goes semi-viral. These people are like, what the heck? And, I think, okay, good deed done on my part, exposing this company. And that would have been the end of it. Except care.com was really pissed. So they decided somehow that they were going to call Stanford and get me in trouble. And this is where the story gets crazy. Care.com has 3 board members who are Stanford alums and presumably donors. Care.com's largest shareholder was Google's venture capital fund, Capital G, and Google has a lot of ties to Stanford. Google's CFO was on the Stanford board. And to my amazement, I get an email from the dean of students at Stanford saying, hey, we need to meet with you about your computer activity, like something's wrong, and we got a complaint against you. And I was just so confused. I was like, is this care.com related? Because, it happened 4 days ago or something, or like that doesn't make any sense. Did I do something else? What did I do? Was I illegally streaming movies? Did I do something wrong? I'm like just so confused. So I'm like, okay, I'll meet with you. And keep in mind, I'd never really been in serious trouble at this point. And I meet with them, and they're like, we got a complaint from this care.com company. Like, do you know why? And I'm like, I brought in a copy of my report, presumably, as I thought they might be asking it. So I give them a copy of my report, and I explain what I did. And I think they'd be like, good job. And they're like, thank you for admitting to everything. And I'm like, what the hell? You're admitting to everything? What? I'm admitting to something. And they're like, yeah, you violated, their terms of service, and violating a company's terms of service while using Stanford Wi-Fi is an honor code violation. And I'm like, you guys are such jokers. I didn't say that. I'm just thinking this isn't completely kosher. And it's the dean of students and head of computer security with me, and they're like, yeah, we tracked your computer Wi-Fi usage, and we determined you violated their terms. Like, you guys are nuts. And then they're like, would you consider taking your article down? And I now I know, okay, so you're just bullying me into taking my article down. And I say, I'm pretty sure my exact words were I'd prefer not to. And they're like, well, what do you think about it? And I'm like, no. And they're like, well, will you like, at least not use Stanford Wi-Fi for your future activities like this? And I said, I'll look into it. And they're getting like really pissed at me, but I think I'm like right. And they're like, well, this is a serious violation. You can be in trouble if they complain again. We might need to bring charges, blah, 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 blah. And, I call my dad, as like one college student would do, and he's freaking out. He's like furious with me. He's like, how can you be meeting the dean of students, you idiot? Take your article down, blah, 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 blah. He's like, totally does not have my side. And I'm convinced I'm right. Like, I'm allowed to criticize companies. He's like, I'm spending 75 grand for you to get it. Like, everybody's furious with me. But I'm like, no, something doesn't add up here. So I decide, I need to dig into this company. And for the first time in my life, I file a FOIA request with Care.com's state attorney general, the Massachusetts attorney general. And I didn't really know what I was doing, but I'm like, maybe they have consumer complaints. So I do that. And 3 months later, I get a call from the Massachusetts Attorney General, and they're like, do you want it like in PDF format, or do you want like us to mail you a CD? And I'm like, what are you talking about? They're like, we have 250 pages of complaints against Care.com. Do you want a PDF or do you want a CD? And I'm like, I guess email me a PDF. And then when I got that, like, I was just amazed, like over and over again. Parents were complaining about like illegal billing, auto billing, background checks that didn't work, safety issues, all that. And then I knew there was some serious issue with Care.com. So I filed FOIA requests with every other state attorney general, and that's how I learned like how to like all the state systems work and the differences between them, and which states like have a lot of complaints and not. So I end up with like thousands of pages of consumer complaints against Care.com. And then I go to big city police departments and I'm like, can I have copies of all police reports that mention the word Care.com? And I go and can I say like all audio calls, like audio logs of Care.com mentioned in 911 calls? And from one city, I get like, an Excel sheet with every time the word Care.com was used in a 911 call or something. And then I start sending letters to all the addresses, because I had like all the personal info is redacted, but the addresses aren't, being like, hey, can you tell me stories of like why your home address called 911 about a Care.com babysitter? So I'm doing all the possible work I can do. And on my last day of classes, my last day in my sophomore year, I published another article on Care.com. That way they couldn't get me in trouble. So I fly home. And then that article gets a lot of attention. And I'm convinced there's a big story. There's something very, very wrong with this Care.com company. So I think I literally cold email like 100 journalists. I cold email every single every FBI, like state FBI office has a PR department. I cold email every single FBI PR department. I cold email like hundreds. I became obsessed. I definitely have like some autism or like neuroticism in me, where I'm just just going insane. And long story short, a Wall Street Journal reporter like replied and met with me, and I go in like this crazy person, hundreds of pages of documents on this company Care.com, and I explain it all to him, and he's like, wow, this is really interesting. I'm going to look into it. And long story short, 9 months later, on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, Care.com babysitters who failed background checks killed 8 kids. Amazing story by Gregory Zuckerman and 2 other reporters. And and I get mentioned in the story. I don't get a lot of credit, but I get mentioned in the story. And that was huge vindication. The stock started selling off. I think it ended up falling 50%. The CEO, CFO, and general counsel all resigned or like are fired under pressure. And it's like, me as a college student kind of took down the big company and did a really good deed, because this company was lying to parents and causing kids to die unnecessarily. And then they were sold to IAC, and IAC actually invested a lot in safety and doing the background checks properly on babysitters. But from there, I was hooked. That's where I went from just a random college student tweeting about stocks to like somebody who knows what they're doing. And all the college people I knew, I like was talking about Care.com nonstop. And then when they see the Wall Street Journal reporter and me quoted, I get a lot of street cred on Stanford.
Right.
So that's more or less what got me hooked and got me credible. And that's why people frankly cared about my newsletter when I launched it. If you are a 21, 22-year-old launching a newsletter, why would anyone on Wall Street care? But if you're like, oh, you're that guy who like was, involved in exposing that company, then people care.
Mhm.
And that's what led to a lot of people signing up and probably like ending up paying for my newsletter at least. So that was good.
So getting your ass busted by Stanford for a little bit while was all worth it in the end. A follow-up to that question would be, how do you worry about litigation risk with the work that you're doing? And if you allow me to add, like the second part is that on the podcast that you did with Carson Block on the Bear Cave newsletter, the one on YouTube, and on other podcasts as well, he says that, like short sellers that he's met tend to be socially awkward and introverted. That struck me as such an oxymoron because being an activist short seller, you're taking the most public of public battles. What personality traits have you seen in these guys that they have this strong of a passion that overrides their introversion?
Yeah, I like what Mark Cahotas says. He says all great short sellers have a genetic defect. So the issue here is for most people, if you're just looking at your own life, you could go into longs, you can make a lot of money, you could not be
Yeah.
involved in controversy, you don't really get sued, you're like more or less fine.
Yeah.
So if you're talented and you don't choose that, there almost has to be something wrong with you. And I kind of agree to that to like some extent. Well, other traits, like at least just from the little I know of everybody else, sure, most short sellers like to be very individualistic, are kind of skeptical about everything in their life.
Mhm.
I might be the exception, but most short sellers seem to be like a little miserable or like tormented
Yes,
in their own
yeah.
mind.
I was gonna ask you that because you come across as like such a nice guy, so humble. And like when you interviewed Mark Cahoda, it's like he's just all stern and serious. Like it's like that personality element of it as well.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think for me, I've seen like, you look at the history of whistleblowers or short sellers and you see like how it's tough being a like people like whistleblowers often end up committing suicide, getting into drug addictions, getting
Mhm.
miserable, having their life spin out of control and collapsing. And seeing all that makes me extra vigilant to make sure that doesn't happen
Mhm.
to me. So one of the basic things I do is I don't bet against any of the companies I write
Yep.
about. That helps like preserve your independence. I'm just a 25-year-old with a popular blog, a popular newsletter, and I think that's an
Mhm.
honest way to make a living.
Right.
So that kind of gives me like a comfort and ease of sleeping at night. I try
Sure.
to save a lot of cash, so I always have extra cash on hand, so I don't need to
Mhm.
worry about that. Luckily, the newsletter has been financially successful, so I mean,
Yep.
save a lot of money, invest a lot of money, have a lot of cash. That's good. I'm really good at trying to take care of my health. I try to walk 15,000 steps every day. I have the world's biggest water bottle. I think I take more steps and drink more water than just about anybody on the planet. I do that a lot. So
Uh-huh.
seeing all that, at least for me, has been like a very, very like important reminder to prioritize mental health, physical
Yep.
health, spiritual health, all that, to try to do good work. Um, so
Mhm.
I think that answers your question.
Sure. You did speak the seed of the idea for care.com started from one of your friends who said that, hey, this company is sketchy. But I did want to talk about your research process. For the most part, where does an idea start? What are your information sources and what key variables on the qualitative side of a business are you focused on?
So I'm a Twitter addict. I probably
Mhm.
spend 2 hours a day on Twitter. I have like a curated list of all these
Uh-huh.
small accounts I follow that tweet about individual stocks that might pique my interest. So Twitter DMs, Twitter comments, that is a common way that something just might pop up on my radar. Another game I like to play if I'm ever bored or looking for a new idea is this game I call board roulette. So what I
Uh,
do if I need new ideas is I look at a bunch of busted IPOs or SPAC mergers and I go to the company. I use this tool called Insider Score. I look up the company, I look up the board members, and I quickly see the board members of this failed company. What other boards do they serve on? Because if your first company failed, I kind of want to bet against your second company or your other. And I keep expanding on that. And that allows me to literally go through hundreds hundreds of companies, maybe in just a day, and find a few that have very questionable or dodgy board members, or like a really weak board. And then from there, you get 20 companies or 10, and you can narrow it down to 3 that seem interesting, just Googling them, looking at their website. And it's like, if I can't understand what you do, or you seem sus, or you have bad customer reviews, I want to dig in a little deeper. What was the second part of your question?
The second part is, what key variables are you focused on? And what are you did speak about the information sources.
So the key variables like I'm looking at is I like to bucket things and companies into 2 different buckets. I look at companies that are misleading investors, or sorry, companies that are harming customers, or companies that are misleading investors. So the harming customers is really just like consumer complaints, looking at YouTube, looking at Reddit, looking at social media. I find that hedge fund managers in general often want to be a little fancy and highbrow. I just want to know what customers think and really try to get a deep understanding. When you do this a lot, you learn which review sites are credible, which ones aren't credible, how to differentiate nonsense from substantive issues. So you do that a lot. And, right away, you might find like a few egregious examples of companies that are just mistreating their customers. And especially I look for this for like newer businesses, like a recent IPO or SPAC merger. To me, that's more important than for a business that's been around for 20 years. Because if you've been around for 20 years and successful in the public markets for 20 years, then these issues probably aren't as egregious as you might think they are. So that is like one example. And then the other one is companies that are misleading investors, or a term I like to use is lack economic substance. So on the misleading investors front, it's just, if I like read your investor presentation, or was a reasonable person trying to understand what you do, but came away with a completely different understanding of what you actually do, then you're like misleading people, or you lack economic substance. So we talked about Agile aerial systems, where the investor presentation is all about next generation delivery drones, but you're actually more or less just like a stock promotion with like a history of bad actors. Another example that comes to mind is Embark Trucking. They went public in a multi-billion-dollar SPAC merger. They had a 25-year-old CEO. All the other executives were, his friends from college. Unlike all their competitors making autonomous trucking software, they had no patents, and their competitors had hundreds and hundreds of patents. And they said they instead relied on trade secrets. The SEC had a lot of comment letters on them that were particularly illuminating. And then they had one real engineer from Tesla who joined them, who left after 6 months. So it's like, hey, the adult in the room who comes, leaves right away. And then, you look on Glassdoor, and it turned out they had a ton of 5-star reviews posted on one particular day. And I look up that day, and that day was the day their SPAC merger was announced. So it seemed like, in their investor presentation, Embark Trucking said, our CEO, this young prodigy named Alex Rodriguez, the CEO, he made the first autonomous vehicle in Canada. I'm like, oh, that's cool. This guy's probably really smart. Let me look into this. And then you find an article from his high school saying he made an autonomous golf cart. And it's just like, okay, you're kind of playing games here, and I don't like it. So I write this article saying, I think they're more bark than bite. I kind of don't believe what's going on here. And that company collapsed 99% plus since its SPAC merger. And that's what that's kind of the ideal thing, finding these companies that somehow get multi-billion-dollar valuations that just have no absolute substance and are going to go 90% lower. And then another company I wrote on is Airbnb. Airbnb is obviously a real and valuable business. It's impressive what they've done. But just as an outsider a few months ago, I thought, okay, they're a platform for millions of disjointed home listings. They're the only place you can go to get access to the homes on their platform. And in reality, there's like a big shift on Airbnb toward professionally managed properties, professional management property groups. The individual ones like seem to have a lot of issues. And oftentimes you can book directly off platform for a lower amount, direct with like the professional management groups. I'm like, hey, the layman's investor's understanding of Airbnb and what's actually going on and in the future is very different. And I think this is going to really impact the value of the company. So I wrote on that. That's kind of like what I would say I'm doing.
Right. So how do you make sure, for a company that is, let's say, not an outright fraud, but is doing something in some area that could be deceptive, how do you make sure you don't have that selection bias where you're just focusing on just the pure negatives of what they're doing, but that might not have such a large overall impact on the business operation. So how do you make sure that you're not negatively selecting on just a few things, but it's a big thing that could have future ramifications?
So, I mean, I would say if you look at every company, and every company I look at has some huge issues, then I'm doing something wrong, right?
Right.
But I'm
Yeah.
looking at hundreds and hundreds of companies and narrowing it down and like kind of almost eliminating things. And some of it's just intuition or common sense or just trying to figure out how material it is to the business. When you do FOIA a lot, I start to get a spidey sense for just how egregious issues are. So you might see a lot of consumer complaints, but I like to go look at the 1-star reviews for anything. And if the 1-star reviews are like frivolous things like, oh, the manager smelled bad, or like, my hotel room, the window view wasn't good, like, then it's like, okay, that's fine. But if it's really, really egregious stuff and the
Right.
company doesn't have good responses when probed by a regulator and it just doesn't make sense, then it's a serious issue. I like to think, what would happen if this company went away tomorrow? And I think there's a bunch of businesses that if a company went away tomorrow, everybody would almost be better off. These things are like Playtika is an example of that, multi-billion-dollar company. I think Israel listed, but a lot, or like headquartered in Israel, but like a lot of Chinese ownership. And they just make a lot of gambling apps that prey on old people who are like sitting at home and lonely and bored and like spending tens of $1,000s playing, fake slots on their phone. And it's just like that type of company, isn't that valuable, and it's just not good for the world. And if you can show that all these apps are in decline and the future is really like negative on them, that's a real problem. And there is, you also want to like look at the valuation and see if the market understands it. If you go and you say, hey, look, this is a payday lender and payday lenders are bad, and I think the future for most payday lenders doesn't look good, but it's trading at 1.5 times earnings, then the stuff you might be saying is true, but the market's clearly pricing that in, right? You're not doing anything useful or like valuable for the world. On the other hand, there was this company called OppFi, and they said, we're like next generation financial, like we help people build credits. And I was just confused. I'm like, I literally can't understand what you do from your investor presentation. And you just like look in the SEC filings and they're like, yeah, the average interest rate on our loans is 140%. I'm like, you're a payday lender. And then you start like probing in a little more, and it's actually like they harm the credit of more people they help, and they have a lot of like investigations, and the people involved don't seem that impressive, and all these other things. And then it's like, okay, and this thing is valued at some stratospheric multiple, being taken public by a family. It's like, okay, now I understand. The market's misunderstanding what you guys actually do. You're misrepresenting it. I can write on you. So it comes down to that. And over time, it's gotten a lot easier now that the newsletter has, I think, 47,000 free readers. I get tons of inbound tips. I get a ton of people tagging me in tweets. Like, coming up with ideas is actually the easiest part. I have too many ideas to look at.
Have any of your ideas started with you reading the financial statements and not understanding them? How do you rate your accounting skills? And have you ever asked have you yourself done like a forensic accounting screen on a company you flagged, or have you ever asked someone else to do a forensic accounting screen on a
Raj,
company
I'm not
interested?
really into accounting. I'm not that sophisticated when it comes to it. Now, I think I know the basics.
Right.
I can understand things. I'm quick at learning things, and there's people I can go to. Like, I'm a fan of like at Footnoted. Like, she would probably be the person I would DM if I had a question about something. But I'm not really accounting focused, and I'm not really valuation or comps focused. I like to say an example of a company I would never write on is like Hershey's or Tootsie Roll. I would never say, oh, I think cocoa prices are going up, so Hershey's margins will compress. Or I'd never say like, oh, I think they channel stuffed a little this quarter. I'm focused on really egregious things, $1 to $10 billion public company that I think can fall 80% or more, that's not really being written about, that doesn't have a high short interest, that no one's talking about, that is just lying, that with dishonest management, that is either going to like collapse soon or be a perennial underperformer. I want to bet against. I like to say public market winners win and public market losers lose. I want to bet against the losers.
Have you ever read a really, really bad sell side report of a company that you have written about, And what is the most hilarious example that comes to mind where the sell side research was just completely divorced from reality? I believe 3 months or 3 weeks, I cannot remember exactly when. 3 months or 3 weeks before Enron collapsed, I think Goldman Sachs equity research had named them the best of the best. Yeah.
I think, I really don't read that much sell side. I probably
Uh-huh.
would if I had like easy access to it, just so I can understand what normal people's like expectations are. Now, the one example that comes to mind is I told you I wrote on Embark Trucking.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This multi-billion-dollar stock merger, 25, 26-year-old CEO. And I thought I like highlighted just like a lot of egregious stuff. And the stock reacted to my article. And, I thought it was great. And one of the analysts covering that company said, like, hey, I read your article. Can you do a phone call with me? And I always do phone calls. It's good to see what other people think. Maybe they're going to poke
Mm-hmm.
holes in it. And we get on this phone, and I think, the guy starts off being polite. He's like, I read this, but like you say the CEO is 25, but like Mark Zuckerberg was 25. And he's like, you're 25. What's wrong with being 25? Like, are you saying a 25-year-old can't do anything great? And I'm like, well, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying it's a piece in a mosaic, and you can be great at a young age. It's just that's one piece of a broader mosaic of like red flags here. And he was kind of upset that he didn't get the gotcha he wanted. And then he keeps going on. He's like, you mentioned that a lot of the VC firms were bad, but have you heard of Sequoia before? Because Sequoia China is the investor in this. I'm like, come on, dude, like this is not like real work. It's like, but they are a real company. I've ridden in their trucks, and I'm like, I can't tell you about like the demo you've been on. Like there's fake demos, or like it's just because they have, it just like, this guy, I think he thought he'd done a lot of work, but I was left, bizarrely unimpressed. Um,
Mm-hmm.
with that. And so and the stock fell 99% plus, and it was a complete nonsense thing. So, that would probably be the one guy that stands out as like, you kind of got it wrong.
Uh-huh. What's next for the Bear Cave, man? Like, where do you see the business heading? And do you think you'll be doing this 10 years from now?
So newsletters are very much a long-term game. Now the bear cave, the growth, I'm almost earning more. Like every month I get a pay raise because more
Yeah.
people sign up and more people are paying for it. So you should want to do it for a very long time, because as the time goes on, it just becomes more and more valuable. So I
Mhm.
do hope to do it for a long time. I love it. I think it's honest work. I think it's good work. I think it's beneficial for the world. I think I'm very talented at it. You get compensated for it. I'm very proud of this newsletter. So I think I'm going to do this newsletter for a long time. And
Mhm.
I don't think it's something I could easily sell, because I don't think you want to read the Bear Cave written by some other random person.
Yeah.
You're paying for my like insight and analysis and
Mhm.
opinions. Now, where it gets tougher is, what else are you going to do? Because I think I have big ambitions. So, what else could I do? I think the next step for me, I have a few ideas. Okay. One is I want to get into YouTube. I really, really, really
Okay.
want to start making YouTube content. And my kind of game plan here is, when I write a Bear Cave report and it does really well, and it's something that could have broad market appeal, for example, Planet Fitness and talking about how they're screwing over customers and their cancellation policies, I think I would kill it making like 5 to 8 minute YouTube videos. Here's how Planet Fitness is screwing over millions of Americans in 8 minutes or less. And just
Mhm.
go through it and explain why like some shady businesses want your debit cards and not credit cards, so you don't have the ability to do disputes. And because there's so much anger and frustration with corporate American corporations that are screwing hardworking people over, but the people who are criticizing corporations aren't good at articulating and showing evidence and making good arguments. And I think I'd be somebody who could balance the two, between the anger but actually being able to show evidence and differentiate between the egregious and non-egregious stuff. Like, I'm sure Walmart has issues, and I'm sure
Mhm.
Walmart, has some problem, but they're not like, you would never be upset at Walmart as a business if you actually see the shenanigans going on with these really bad companies harming hardworking people. And it's just so like frustrating for me that we can never focus on the really egregious bad actors. So YouTube channel would be a big part of it. I
Mhm.
could, in theory, launch a long bias newsletter. The market for that would be big. I think I could make something that would be really profitable. I'm not sure I want to. Like, does the world need
Mhm.
a newsletter to help come up with long ideas? shouldn't I double down? I'm not sure I want to do that, but maybe I could do that. So YouTube would be big. I've had the idea of launching like undergrad stock competitions. I did one last year that got some attention. Maybe I do another one this year. I've thought of maybe starting a conference business, like to compete in some ways with Ira Sohn, with the idea being, hey, cut all the nonsense, no big name managers, just high performing small managers, managing less than $1 billion. We're going to do, 10, 15-minute stock pitches back to back to back, 30 minutes of networking at the end. I think people would pay for that in New York City. And there'd be, but I don't know, maybe I'm like going to overextend myself. I want to make a LinkedIn competitor in some sort of way, or something that would compete with like, I want it to be easier for talent to be discovered, because why on LinkedIn can you not post a video? Like photos are kind of nonsense, but videos give, like, why can't I have a 3-minute video of me pitching myself to employers? That's a much more effective way to sell. You get the personality, you get the maturity, you get whatever. Why can't I upload a bunch of my past work or stock pitches, stock write-ups to my LinkedIn? That would make all this. If I'm looking at someone, I kind of don't care about the resume. I care about your personality, which comes across in the video, and I care about your research skills, what's come about. And why can't I upload a PDF with like a 5-page stock pitch to my LinkedIn? It makes no sense, or you can, but it's like, it's not designed around that. There's a room for like some sort of like identity website for everyone in finance who wants to participate, that revolves around not so much accomplishments and education, but like raw talent. And I think there would be like value for that and like helping people. So I have like tons of business ideas in my head. I think at some point though, I need to figure out, do I want to do barricade and shift more into like public advocate journalism type stuff? Do the YouTube, become kind of a voice of the people fighting large corporations? Or do I want to take the more entrepreneur path? Let's build a bunch of companies and see if I can work my magic to make something happen. Or do you do the third path and say, actually, I think I'm talented with stocks. Let me see if I can make a lot of money to launch a hedge fund? Or do you do the fourth thing, which is get pissed with it all, retire in 5 years, and just become like a public defender? And like, I think I'd be a great lawyer than just like messing around and like, could get anybody.
Would you want to be a lawyer? Would you want to
No, I think it would be funny if I became a public defender. I would love being a public defender, the world's best public defender, or like being a teacher or whatever, and like writing a newsletter on a side. I don't know. I got a lot of random ideas, but the most pressing thing for me is growing the barricade, getting the income up, and using that money to like launch a really great YouTube channel focused on exposing corporate misconduct.
Sure. Thanks for sharing that. In a podcast that you did in December 2021, you said that your portfolio was basically 80% Twitter at the time and 20% Bitcoin. What makes you bullish on Bitcoin? I think Chanos and Carson Block have opined that they just think they're tulips.
I no longer have that opinion on Bitcoin. I don't own any Bitcoin, and I don't own any Twitter.
Yep, of course. That was my follow-up on Twitter.
Bitcoin, no strong opinion on. I think it's a little, and I feel differently about Bitcoin than all other cryptos. All other cryptos kind of seem like nonsense to me. Bitcoin, there are actually like use cases. If you look in Africa, there's like a lot of people who have been using it as like, I think people misunderstand it a little, where in places with a strong rule of law and strong banking system, yeah, Bitcoin's kind of frivolous because that strong rule of law and strong banking system works well for most people. Okay, so in the US, but when you don't have strong rule of law, when you don't have a strong banking system, when you can't trust your money in a bank, when you can't trust that it won't be, then Bitcoin has a lot of it. It's like an imported rule of law and banking system to places. And I don't think, I kind of get that. And I think it could be valuable. I still do think it could be valuable in the long run. Now with Twitter, I mean, maybe I'm an optimist. I see huge potential for Twitter. The execution has never been there under the old management. The execution is a little struggling under the new management. I also don't think, you should have all your money in one stock. Like, I'm a little crazy, just, mentally sometimes. So now my goal for me personally is ideally earn money with the newsletter. The main goal should always be to do good
Um,
work, do things that are useful for the world.
mhm,
But in terms of like personal finances, I'd like to save a lot and find just 3 or 4 micro caps, small caps, and just invest in them every week. And, hopefully you do well.
mhm.
And if I'm not going to do that, I'm going to index. What I don't want to do is own like a collection of 40 companies and spend a lot of time and mental power on that, because even if you outperform a little, you're probably not going to outperform after taxes. And it's like, this is like really what you want your gift to the world to be, is like trying to outperform by 1%. I don't know.
Mhm. Yeah, Edwin, you've spoken a lot about how saving money is really important to you, how that career independence of you having your time for yourself is really important to you. And as we close, that's something that I really wanted to ask you about, is this question of independence that's really important to me, and I'm sure really important to a lot of our listeners listening to this. There's something really fiercely independent about the way you live your life, both in terms of the career independence you have with the Bear Cave and also the financial independence, because it has been financially successful. Prior to starting the Bear Cave, you said that you did have thoughts of taking a job at a hedge fund, but what was your mindset like? That okay, let's if I did get a job, if I worked the traditional whatever a hedge fund job right out of college, what was your mindset in terms of like, when do I want to venture out on my own after that? By what age or by how many years after doing a job out of college did you want to venture out on your own?
I sometimes you just go with the flow. And for me, it was more like I'd started this newsletter and it was going great. And I loved the independence and freedom. And there's a saying, once you work for yourself, you can't work for anyone else. And it's kind of true. Once you see the light or
Yeah,
the freedom, you can't go
yeah,
back. I think it's tough to have like, oh, a 5-year plan. I'm going to do something for 2 years and then do something else for 2 years. And then I'm going to venture out on your own. It's more, I see the opportunity. I took the opportunity and I was lucky enough for it to work. And now that I have the freedom, it's not like I'm thinking back in time to like, oh, what could it have been otherwise. I do think though, I deeply feel
mhm,
that it's important to if you want to do what I do and speak truth to power and criticize and build something great, having the fierce independent is really important. I couldn't do what I do if I was working for a big institution, because even
yeah,
if the institution stood by me as I like started criticizing companies or something, even if I had a job not in finance, eventually somebody's going to get a phone call. This guy's like, no institution wants a young person who's attacking like corruption on Twitter. That's just,
yeah,
what I need to do is I need to have a lot of independence. And it goes even to your customer base. I don't want any like one customer being one more than 1% of my revenue. It's great to have like just thousands of different readers who are paying you, because then no one can have a string over you. No one can apply pressure. And I see that like with Stanford and, so I think a lot about that. If you want, and it helps not to have a wife and kids, because those are like
yeah,
other angles to pressure. And it's like, if you want to being as independent as you can, allows you to like be like a lot less stressed and free to like
mhm,
criticize, if that
right,
makes sense. And so if I really want to amp this up, if I want to become a person who is just all about like criticizing corruption and maybe even making like a whole news organization just around doing like these weird deep dive investigations into companies and corruption elsewhere, you need to be as fiercely independent as possible. And the way to do that is to have thousands of readers who pay for what you do. So that's kind of did
right.
that answer the question?
Yeah, it did for sure. On the podcast that you did with Carson Block, in the end, you asked him a question, which was, I think, somewhere around the lines of like, what do you not like about your life now? And his response was that I really hate people putting me on a pedestal. Like when I'm meeting someone, they want me to like tell them their opinion about a company, or to think I know everything. And he was like, even when I'm at like my children's whatever school, I have to put up a face. And you've also achieved at a very young age that kind of recognition and that kind of fame. Has that been kind of traumatic? Have you welcomed it? Is it annoying when yo-yos like me are reaching out to you every day? What is that experience with like this fame and this recognition that you have? What
You
has that
know,
experience been like?
I love it. I don't know if I would say I'm famous, but I'm
Yeah.
getting there,
Yeah.
maybe future famous.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like it, especially now. I love meeting new people. And what I
Uh-huh.
do, it's kind of lonely. I write my newsletter. So of course it's great to have people reaching out and going for a walk with someone new every day, or a lunch or a dinner or phone
Hmm.
calls or whatever. It's great, keeps you, it's much better than just being on your laptop all day alone. So
Right.
I like that. I like it when you're young. I think maybe once you have kids, you probably wouldn't like it as much.
Yeah.
So luckily, I think the worst thing you can do is get famous late in life. The best thing you can do
Uh-huh.
is get famous when you're young and single and you
Yeah.
look okay, and
Yeah.
yeah, then it's kind of good. I do feel like some people aren't genuine around you, maybe, or they
Yeah.
might have ulterior motives. So you need to be
Hmm.
a little more suspect of that, which isn't so nice. One thing I think I've always struggled with is getting along with people my age. It's like, just even looking now, like the people I walk with are often in their 30s or 40s. A lot of the people I talk to are just a lot older than me. And I do have obviously a few friends my age, but I think if you just looked, just with the average age of people I socialize with, it's like at least 10 years older than me. And, that's, you know, my inability to like, I think ever like really relate to people my age or like feel
Uh-huh.
like a normal person, pluses and minuses.
Right. Yeah, I did want to get back to another piece of advice since we have young listeners who want to be in your place doing what you do. You did speak about that, if you went to work at a hedge fund, you probably wouldn't like cranking out models all day or going in a suit or tie. But if you leave those two aspects of it aside, what is your opinion about hedge funds that do recruit out of undergrad? Because there are very few. So it's like Point 72, Citadel, D Shaw, Bridgewater, very hard to break in. Companies like I think Point 72 has more than 2,000 employees. In your experience, since you've all 4 years out of undergrad, you've interned at hedge funds, you've rubbed shoulders with giants in the investment industry. How many analysts in a team in a hedge fund actually end up adding value to the research process? And what is your opinion about like some of these funds? If what maybe if you don't want to take their name, if the opinion is negative, but what is your opinion about like the kind of funds that are recruiting out of undergrad, and how many analysts do you think in a fund actually end up adding value?
I secretly think a lot of people on Wall Street, if you like gave them a little bit of money and computer access and said you need to outperform for the next 20 years, like couldn't do it. And you get a lot of like, nonsense. Well, we have lower data, we're more hedged, we have a lot of cash, blah, blah, blah. If you just take, I think a lot of people couldn't outperform in the long run if they're given the
Yeah.
opportunity. Here's a few, you asked a lot of stuff. So here's a few things I'd like to say. First, a lot of people say they don't recruit direct out of undergrad, but there's always a way. That like these
Yes.
people don't care like whether people care what you can do for them. And why don't people want to hire directly out of undergrad? Well, you might not have the emotional maturity. You might come in with a lot of problems. You might just complain a lot. You're probably not going to be able to add value day one. It's not that, they care what you can do for them. So to the extent that you can like actually demonstrate that you'd be great, that's good. For me, I'd always prefer, just knowing my personality, to work for a small organization and not a large one. So,
Mm-hmm.
if I was a college student looking to go direct in the buy side, yeah, shoot your shot with the big funds, but find the 20 like funds in your area that are small and send them a letter or send them an email. And guess what? Almost no one's reaching out to them. So
Yeah.
there you go. Or another thing you can do is look at the big funds, look at on LinkedIn, look at the big funds on LinkedIn, and it'll show you, oh, here's the people from your school who work there, and reach, for whatever reason, people like helping people from their school. I think it's a little odd, but fine, and reach out to them and see if they'd be willing to meet with you. And and the thing is, once you get into the habit of reaching out to people as a college student, it gets a lot easier to do it
Yeah.
going forward. um in terms of like the culture working there, I think the thing you learn is like it's different everywhere.
Mhm.
I've had great bosses, I've had mediocre bosses, and there's been firms like you admire, but you don't admire the person or team you're on.
Yeah.
There's just like a lot of things to consider. And you just remember, it's you think it's all about you when you're young. The world revolves
Yeah.
around you, but it doesn't. And it's what you can do for them. And the
Yeah.
sooner you can get that out of your system, like the better.
Yeah. But I will say that the funds that do have a more of a traditional recruiting process and the ones that I named they do, whereas like some of the smaller funds, it's like, hey, you have to like knock on their door many times for them to like set up a conversation or whatever. Many times I've seen that they don't expect the most legendary stock pitch or even an above average stock pitch that a small fund expects. Like they really expect you to know your stuff. Whereas a lot of these larger funds have the capacity for training. So they're probably looking at more overall factors like, does this person have good analytical skills? From what many people I've spoken to, they've said in the interview process, they weren't actually even asked a single finance stock pitch question, valuation question. So yeah, it can really vary. And yeah, you just have to roll with the punches. So
I'll just say a little on this. Like
yeah.
my blood kind of boils thinking about like some of the questions I've been asked in like internship interviews and stuff. There's a lot of like I've never understood why people don't focus on like
Yeah.
actual brain teasers, random stuff. Never
Yeah.
has made a lot of sense to me. So
Yeah. And you get a lot of those, especially in investment banking. When it comes to what you're doing today, Edwin, what advice would you give to a college kid who wants to be doing what you're doing today? Maybe not on the short selling side, maybe on the long side, maybe just on like general investor education, something investment related, who wants to start some a kind of a venture that you have, make a little bit of money publishing that research or whatever it is. What's the way to do it? Is it a blog? Is it a newsletter? Is it YouTube? Is it Twitter? What's the way to do it?
generally, I like to think like if I was a college student, how can you increase your luck surface area and get things rolling? A
Mhm.
professional Twitter account where you're interacting with people, you're asking questions, you're keeping it professional, and you're like contributing to FinTwit. That's a great way to start increasing luck, and you're going to start interacting, and meetings will happen, and people will like be interested in you. So Twitter, I think, is key if you keep it professional and useful. That's a great thing. I think what you're doing, a podcast interview series, is actually genius because
Mhm.
it costs no money to start. The downside, like you do two and it doesn't get any traction, whatever,
Yeah.
but then there's tremendous upside in that, hey, maybe it gets a huge following and you can make money from it. That's not necessarily super likely, but maybe you impress a lot of these guests and
Uh-huh.
then the guests become your own advocates in spreading like, oh, this guy is awesome. Raj is awesome. Like, and then when and the guest is asked, oh, do you know any smart
Uh-huh.
people to be hired? They'll think of you. So I think actually starting like a podcast or an interview series of some sorts is a genius thing to do. I like to joke that if you're a college student and email a successful person and say, hey, can I ask you random questions for 15 minutes? They're going to say no. But if you say, hey, can I ask you questions for 15 minutes on my podcast? A lot of them will magically say yes. And not only do you get the questions, you get the credit for the podcast and you get all the luck increasing and all that. So I think just finding ways to like increase your luck surface area. And people, the thing that comes to mind is just like, let me go to class and prepare and ask good questions. And that's all good. But taking initiative to do something like just a little outside the normal or a little extra or just a little something is like key.
Uh-huh. I did want to get back. I'm gonna break the advice section. I did want to get back into this question of independence and working at a large company. I think a lot of people would kill to have the kind of life that you have right now, being totally entirely independent, career-wise, financial-wise. And I've always thought about, all these Fortune 500 CEOs, like, why would they really even want that job in the first place? When you have all this scrutiny on you, you have all this media pressure, you have to do so many things that you don't like doing. Like you have to fire people, you have to go on earnings calls. I'm pretty sure CEOs don't really enjoy that. When the managements that you have analyzed, is it, and especially, of course, on the short selling side, it's like managements that have done things wrong. Has it been because they were sort of, they were crooked to start with, or was it that they were good people, but they were in a business that was struggling, in a business that was in a downturn? There was all of a sudden competition or just some institutional imperative. What do you generally see? The first part of the question would be, What do you think is the motivation for these guys? I asked this question to a lot of people. What do you think is the motivation for these guys who earn tens of millions of dollars to be CEOs when they have to be doing things, a lot of things that they don't probably wouldn't enjoy doing? And the second part is, are these CEOs sort of, so the people that you have analyzed, sort of crooks to begin with, or did they sort of drift in that direction?
Okay, so you said a lot. Let's
Yeah,
see.
yeah, yeah.
Motivation for the CEOs and why do they do stuff they don't want to do? Well, I would say you actually don't need to do a lot of the stuff you don't want to do.
Uh-huh.
They do it, but look at Warren Buffett. He doesn't have earnings calls. He
Yeah.
doesn't spend a lot of time meeting with investors. Even Bezos was like, we spend 2 hours on IR. And like,
Uh-huh.
Danaher cares a lot about IR, but I don't think the CEO is spending a ton of. So you don't like a lot of companies do a lot of nonsense. And
Yeah.
I'm like always amazed by like, what some CEOs are saying. Like, but you don't have to. You can totally break the mold and do short earnings calls or Q&A only
Right.
and not spend a lot of time meeting to investors, or, you can run your business how you want to run your business.
Mm-hmm.
The motivation for a lot of CEOs, I think, is money and power.
Okay.
You do get paid a ton, and
Yeah.
you are top dog. You get to like be king of your kingdom, and that's like attractive to a lot of people. Um, and I think some are inspired to do great work. Like the CEOs who I want to invest in are people who are actually like doing something or trying something or experimenting with something.
Mm-hmm.
And that those now not everybody has their own investing style, but that's what resonates with me. Somebody who's like actually attempting to do something cool. And now for the people I write about, are they crooks or do they drift in that direction? I like to believe no one's like born a crook,
Yeah.
everybody probably like drifts in that direction. And anybody who's crooked, I think it always is just, it becomes more egregious over time. Now, the
Mm-hmm.
thing, my kind of frustration in general in societies, I think all bad behavior should be addressed, but all bad behavior doesn't need the most severe punishment.
Mm-hmm.
And there seems to be this thing in the media is you're either a good guy or a bad guy. And if you're a bad guy, we're going to roast you. It's like Jeff Bezos, does he mistreat employees? Is there problems with Amazon? Maybe. But is he like the worst CEO out there? It's an evil dude? No, of course not. And there's a lot of these guys who are just like rascals trying to like extract money from the system doing nothing. So I focus on the really like egregious people, generally speaking, people who like
Mm-hmm.
they could go away. Their existence probably makes the world worse. So I like to think like the stuff I focus on is really just the most egregious stuff,
Mm-hmm.
generally speaking. Um, a lot of times, Marco Hodes always says it always starts with a little bit of channel stuffing. So this inability to like take a beating and like just admit you're wrong and have the stock go down even a little is, I think, what as how a lot of it starts. So you don't want to miss the quarterly numbers, so you do a little bit of channel stuffing, but then you need to do a little more channel stuffing next quarter to meet the numbers, and then a lot more that after that, and then you need to like play around with the reserves after that, and then it becomes too big. So maybe you have your friend place a big order that is going to be canceled right after that quarter, and then you need to start falsifying it. And like the irony is, I think some people can like some frauds are just super egregious. Some people are just greedy. I think a lot of times it's just you can't take just the L and
Mm-hmm.
just take the wrong, um,
Mm-hmm.
and you end up blowing yourself up for it.
Right. There was one final investing question I had for you. And this was one of the main questions. You said the host said this on one of the podcasts you appeared in, that the short side and the long side don't go really well. Would you agree with that? And the question is like, which mental models on the short selling side could be helpful on the long side? I think both long and short investors are sort of fascinated by fraud, and long investors sort of work hard to like avoid that. But in which areas do you see sort of traditional value investors not really sort of diving really deep into the fundamentals? And a few examples come in mind as well. Like Jim Chanos had shorted DaVita Analysis when I think Berkshire Hathaway was the largest shareholder at the time in the company. There was, I think, another pharmaceutical company that Chanos had shorted, which I think Berkshire owned. Muddy Waters that exposed Sinoforest, in which John Paulson was a shareholder and he lost hundreds of millions. So I think there's something, I think there is there are these mental models on the short selling side that could be helpful on the long side. You have spoken about FOIA requests, SEC filings, and all of that. But which other information sources do you think that long only traditional value investors just don't appreciate that could be very helpful for them in understanding the qualitative sides of the business?
So, looking at a company's relationship with its customers, like I'm amazed at how much time people will have like a detailed model, but won't understand like, oh, our customers generally happy or dissatisfied, or what percent are trying to get out of their contracts. And, just like I think you can learn a lot by like going to YouTube and listening to the CEO speak and just hearing like people talk about the products and reading the comment sections of articles. Though those are kind of universal skills. Now, in terms of like shorts and longs doing different work, I completely agree. I don't think, good short sellers often aren't good at longs, and good longs aren't good investors aren't great at being short sellers, because I do think it's largely different skills. One example is I'm really great at any company I look into, go to the PCAOB auditor search, see the auditor, see the specific audit partner, and determine whether or not they're credible. That might be good at highlighting potential frauds or companies to bet
Right.
against. It has no bearing. Like you have a strong auditor. That doesn't mean you're like a good investment on the long side. Or you have a standard board. There's no egregious problems with your board. Okay, that doesn't mean you're a good long investment. So I do think it's very much different skill sets. What else
Right.
do I think like long investors could learn from like the type of short work you do? I think the one skill that does translate really well is always being skeptical. You never want to necessarily believe management. You need to look out for things yourself. But there seems to be, I think, a lot of times people like fanciness at these big hedge funds. It's like we have these nice offices, we spend a lot of money, we're paid a lot of money, we have the best pedigree, we have nice suits. And
Is
I'm
that
like,
coming from performance fees or management fees?
yeah, exactly. But it's so people
Yeah.
would, it's kind of embarrassing to tell your LPs like, yeah, we got this idea from Twitter. Or a lot of our work is just sifting through like every Twitter comment, seeing if there's one or two really smart things. Or we've spent a lot of time on YouTube watching all the YouTube reviews for this product to like get a deep understanding. I think people rely a little too much on like expert network calls, and I'm like just
Yeah.
generally pretty
Those are
skeptical.
very expensive too.
It's not
Yeah.
even the expense. It's just like then they'll tell you what they want to hear, and it's just like you can do one expert network call for an hour, and you can do 10 of them and hear from 10 people, or you can spend an hour on the internet and hear from 10,000 people. And I don't know. Those are just some of the things I think. I do think there's often like a lot of smart investors, and oftentimes the people getting the most press are like not that impressive, and the most impressive people kind of work in the backgrounds. I'm trying to think of like what else. I think just in general, people give like management like way too much. Like, oftentimes, somebody will call me and they say, "We've read your report. We sent it to management. This is what management says. What's your response?" And I'm like always just a little like kind of thrown off by that, especially when management like doesn't have a good like, for example, there was one company, EXP Realty. They're like an MLM for realtors. And they're very shady. And I wrote on them in the barricade. And one thing they pointed out was their revenue recognition policy changed 2 times over the last 2 years. And the current policy isn't used by any other public company. And you can look at that by using the SEC full text search tool to search the revenue recognition policy and see if any other company uses it. And a hedge fund manager called me. They're like, "We're long the stock. We think you're wrong." And management says there was like a change in accounting rules, and that's why they needed to change it. And I'm like, okay, like, the specific rule? No. Well, they're like, but doesn't that, like, who cares about disclosures? Everybody has disclosures. Like, I'm like, well, can you understand this disclosure? Can you like explain to me in plain English what it means? Because I don't. I understand the older revenue recognition. I don't understand the new. And they're like, yeah, it's kind of confusing. And I'm like, and they're like, but everybody has disclaimers. And I'm like, yeah, but nobody has like disclaimers that nobody else has. There's standardized disclaimers, but if your disclaimer is different than everyone else, there's got to be a reason why. I think Michelle Letter said there's no accidents in SEC filings, and these guys are just like not having the proper skepticism, and the stock's down a lot since that call. So yeah, those are like some of the things.
Leaving investing aside, when you're not thinking about investing, what other passions and hobbies do you have that keep you happy?
I think I told you I
Yeah,
try to walk
walk a
15,000
lot. Yeah.
steps a day. So I try, if the sun's out, I'm not inside. I'm out
Uh-huh.
walking. I'm trying to meet with somebody. So trying to get in shape. Like I've lost a lot of weight over the last year and a half. Just I
Mm-hmm.
want to get in outstanding shape. That's
Uh-huh.
it. I think, there's no better time to do that when you're young. So next time you'll see me, I'm going to look like the Hulk. Okay. I'm really, really trying to get in
Yeah,
shape.
I'm trying to, but being on the job hunt after graduating college and still being in the job hunt does make for some bad sort of late night food. So I'm not making much progress there. Final question, Edwin. Where can people find you and find your work?
The best thing is to just Google the Bear Cave newsletter and follow the newsletter, or you can just Google Edwin Dorsey Twitter and my Twitter will pop up. So follow me on Twitter, follow my newsletter, and every support is greatly appreciated.
Yeah, Edwin, thank you so much for doing this. This was really a lot of fun. You've gone on to do some really cool stuff, man, just a few years out of college, and I really wish you all the best. And as my listeners know, as I've revealed in this podcast, I'm still in the job hunt, hunting for roles on the buy side. So all the advice that Edwin shared is also going to be really helpful for me, not just our listeners. So yeah, Edwin, thank you for bailing me out a little bit from my current circumstances. Super fun talking to you, man. I really wish you all the best with everything ahead.
Raj, thank you so much for having me. Good luck with everything. Great luck with this podcast. And thanks again.
Of course, Edwin.